Welcome to the Global WarWatch Network. Pakistan says the airstrikes were necessary, but with growing reports of civilian deaths, can any justification truly hold? Let's uncover the truth behind the blast. To start with, forget the official statements. This video unmasks the uncomfortable truth about the recent Pakistani airstrikes and asks the hard question: when is a civilian casualty ever justified? We're dissecting the arguments and exposing the brutal impact on the ground.
And that framing, it's really necessary, isn't it? Because the official language, the statements, they often just obscure the harsh realities we find when we dig into International Humanitarian Law, or IHL. We've been asked by you, our listener, to take these raw facts, the recent cross-border tensions, and really put them through the legal grinder, so to speak. We aren't here to give a verdict, obviously, but to understand the actual calculus, the thinking that militaries use when lives are quite literally on the line.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack this by setting the scene first. Our sources, they place this conflict squarely in the context of, heightened tensions along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. This was late 2024. Now, this isn't a new conflict zone by any means, but what specifically pushed things, what escalated it to the point of military airstrikes this time?
Well, the main trigger, according to the reports we've seen, was a pretty significant spike in cross-border attacks. And these weren't just, minor incidents. They seemed coordinated, carried out by the Tehrik-e-Taliban, Pakistan, the TTP, and crucially originating from inside Afghanistan. So for Pakistan, this obviously represented a serious, an unacceptable level of threat to their national security, their sovereignty. It demanded some kind of military response.
And that response came very decisively, it seems, on December 24th, 2024. Can you walk us through the specifics of that action?
Yeah, the details are important here. Pakistani forces used a combination of assets, both manned jets and unmanned aerial vehicles, drones. It was a coordinated series of airstrikes. Their claimed target, the official line, was a TTP training camp. This was located pretty deep within eastern Paktika province, which is, a volatile area right near the border. Pakistani officials, they were quick to declare the operation a success. They asserted they'd eliminated at least 20 TTP militants. So the whole thing was framed as a necessary counter-terrorism measure.
Right. So a clear stated military objective: disrupt this group, the TTP, that's threatening Pakistan. But almost immediately, this action creates significant fallout, both diplomatically and militarily. How did the Taliban, who actually control the territory where these strikes happened, how did they respond?
The response was, immediate and sort of multi-layered. First, the Taliban government, and it's important to remember they don't recognize the Durand line as the border anyway. They retaliated against the strikes themselves. This quickly led to reports of clashes, actual fighting between Afghan and Pakistani forces right there along the border. So it really demonstrates the severe strain these actions put on what was already a very difficult relationship. It sort of shifted the focus, didn't it, from just a counterterrorism operation to potentially an interstate conflict.
And crucially, the tension didn't just stop with military retaliation. It went straight to the heart of the issue we're looking at today, the human cost. The Taliban immediately claimed civilian casualties.
That's the absolute core tension point here. The Taliban claimed that these supposedly precise, targeted Pakistani airstrikes resulted in the deaths of non-combatants. And what makes this specific incident so important for our discussion today is that this claim, it wasn't just dismissed as, typical propaganda, international organizations actually weighed in.
The United Nations confirmed it, confirmed the tragedy.
Precisely. The UN confirmed that civilians, and tragically, this included women and children, were killed in these Pakistani airstrikes inside Afghanistan. So this international validation of non-combatant deaths, it puts the Pakistani justification, necessary counterterrorism in direct opposition, really, to the fundamental moral and, critically, the legal constraints on warfare.
So this is the foundational question we really need to dissect for you, the listener. On one hand, we have the rationale, national security, targeting a specific military objective like a TTP camp. But the consequence, the outcome, is the loss of protected civilian lives confirmed by the UN. And this forces us right up against that question. When, if ever, is civilian loss justified under the strict framework of international law? Is there actually a legal mechanism that accepts the death of a child as a consequence of military necessity?
To even begin to answer that, we have to move past the political noise and the rhetoric and get into the framework of international humanitarian law. IHL. It's often misunderstood, I think. People see it as just a collection of rules for punishment after the fact, but it's fundamentally designed as a preventive framework. It's meant to be a workable guide for military commanders, people under immense pressure on the ground, influencing their behavior during conflict to try and minimize suffering. It's not just for lawyers after the war is over.
That's interesting. And you mentioned earlier that the idea of rules in war isn't just a modern thing, right? It's almost universal.
It really is. That core idea that warfare must have limits, that it can't be unrestricted. You find that across cultures and throughout history. But in modern IHL, which is primarily established by things like the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, the system really rests on two absolutely central principles. These apply specifically to how you fight what lawyers call inicis in bello, the law in war.
Okay, let's pause there because that's a critical distinction for our audience.
Right.
Pakistan might argue they have the right to self-defense, the right to use force in the first place. That's inis ad bellum, the right to go to war. But that's totally separate from inis in bello, isn't it? The rules for conducting the war itself.
Absolutely vital distinction. You've hit it exactly. Ineus ad bellum determines if starting a conflict is legally permissible, like claiming self-defense. But ineus in bello kicks in once the conflict is underway, and it applies equally to everyone fighting, regardless of who started it or why. So even if Pakistan argues it has a valid right to fight the TTP under ineus ad bellum, it still must abide by the ineus in bello rules, like distinction and proportionality, in every single strike they carry out. No exceptions.
Got it. So let's focus on that first rule of conduct then, the principle of distinction. What does that actually mean in practice?
It's the absolute foundation. It demands that parties involved in a conflict must always distinguish between two groups: the civilian population and civilian objects on one side, and combatants and military objectives on the other. The rule for targeting is crystal clear. Operations must be directed only against legitimate military objectives. So, if a commander knowingly, deliberately targets a civilian home or a hospital, that's a war crime, full stop, regardless of the overall military situation.
Okay, but the reality, especially in modern conflicts, it's messy. We know TTP fighters, for example, they don't wear uniforms. They might blend into villages like the ones in Paktika. So when collateral damage, harm to civilians, seems almost unavoidable, how does IHL constrain the commander then?
Right, and that is precisely the function of the second key principle, the proportionality principle. This is codified in Article 51.5b of Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Conventions. This is the crucial constraint on that unavoidable incidental collateral damage. It prohibits launching an attack if that attack is expected to cause civilian harm. That means loss of life, injury, or damage to civilian objects that would be considered excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated from that specific attack.
Excessive. That single word seems to carry all the weight, doesn't it? Legal scholars often talk about this balancing act, comparing apples and oranges. How on earth do you quantify a civilian life against, say, destroying a militant training camp?
That analogy holds up pretty well because there's no fixed mathematical ratio. You can't say, 3 civilian lives are acceptable for this type of target, but 4 isn't. It's a context-specific judgment. It's often subjective, and it has to be made by commanders in real time, often with incomplete information. To understand how that judgment should be made, though, we need to look closely at both sides of that equation. Let's start with the civilian harm, the apples side, if you like.
Okay, so what specifically does a commander have to factor into that collateral damage assessment? What counts as civilian harm?
Well, first, obviously, the expected death and injury to all protected civilians, and also damage to civilian objects, homes, schools, hospitals, infrastructure. But here's where the detail really matters. The commander must also try to account for foreseeable, long-term, and even indirect effects. I'm talking about the ripple effects, damage to things like electricity stations, water treatment plants, maybe even significant harm to the natural environment that affects civilian survival later. The assessment has to look beyond just the immediate blast crater and consider the wider impact on the surviving population, potentially over weeks or months.
We need to be really clear about who counts as a protected civilian in this calculation, especially when you're talking about a target like a TDP camp where fighters might be mixed with families or others.
That's a critical point. Only protected civilians count as collateral damage for this specific proportionality calculation. Individuals who are actively directly participating in hostilities, what the law calls DPH, they temporarily lose that protected status. For the duration of their direct participation, they're considered legitimate targets, essentially combatants.
But the huge challenge, especially in a place like Paktika, must be identifying that in real time. Imagine a commander looking at drone footage, seeing a group of people near this alleged training camp. How does the burden of proof work there? Which way does the scale tip?
The burden of proof is high, and it rests on the attacker. If there is genuine doubt about whether a person is a civilian or is directly participating in hostilities, that person must be presumed to be a civilian, and therefore protected. This forces commanders, or at least it should force them, to prioritize intelligence gathering, surveillance, verification. You can't just assume everyone near a military target is hostile. So, if a woman is confirmed to be present near that camp, she is presumed protected unless there's compelling evidence showing she is actively fighting or directly supporting the fighting at that moment. Her death, if it occurs, would then count fully towards that excessive threshold in the proportionality assessment.
Okay, that clarifies the civilian harm side. Now let's look at the other side of the scale, the oranges, military advantage. To justify any civilian loss, this advantage has to be concrete and direct. How restrictive is that requirement supposed to be?
It's intended to be quite restrictive. It's meant to severely limit speculation or, vague justifications. The advantage must relate directly to the specific military operation being undertaken. Things like uncertain future advantages, maybe hoping to deter future attacks through fear, or long-term psychological effects, those have to be treated with extreme caution. They likely don't meet the concrete and direct standard. This isn't supposed to be about historical grievances or just sending a message. It has to be about achieving a clear, tangible, tactical, or operational gain from that specific attack.
And you made a point earlier, it's important to reiterate, military advantage is not the same thing as military necessity. They sound similar, but they're different concepts in IHL.
Absolutely not the same, and the distinction is crucial. Think of military necessity as the broader permissive principle. It basically says a state can use the force necessary to achieve its legitimate military objectives, like defeating the enemy. But proportionality acts as a constraint within that necessity. Just because attacking that TTP camp might be considered militarily necessary for Pakistan to achieve its strategic goals against the TTP doesn't automatically mean the attack is proportionate if the expected civilian cost is too high. The means used must still be restrained by proportionality, even if the overall end, disrupting the TTP, is considered necessary.
Okay. Now, there is apparently a controversial element here in how military advantage is sometimes defined, specifically concerning the attacking force's own safety. Can minimizing risk to your own soldiers or pilots be factored into the advantage side of the equation, potentially justifying higher civilian risk?
Yes, and this is highly debated. Some states, and their military manuals reflect this, argue that the safety of the attacking force can be considered a component of the overall military advantage. So, for example, if attacking a target from a very high altitude reduces the risk to the pilot, but maybe increases the weapon's impact radius or decreases accuracy, thus raising the risk to civilians on the ground. Some states argue that the benefit of preserving their pilot or aircraft is a legitimate factor in the overall advantage calculation. Many legal experts and humanitarian organizations strongly contest this, arguing it inherently prioritizes the attacker's safety over the lives of protected civilians, which seems counter to the spirit of IHL. It's a real point of contention.
Wow, that really complicates the calculus, doesn't it? So after trying to weigh this incredibly fraught balance, you've got this hard to quantify human loss on one side, a specific military gain on the other, maybe factoring in your own troops' safety. How does a commander finally decide if the expected civilian harm is actually excessive? What's the tipping point?
The key legal standard is that the expected military advantage must clearly and substantially outweigh the expected civilian harm. IHL is designed to tilt the balance towards protecting civilians, towards humanity. So, if the investment comes out roughly balanced, if the expected military advantage merely equals the expected collateral damage, the attack is prohibited. It fails the proportionality test. In that situation, the attack is considered indiscriminate and must be canceled, postponed, or maybe reconfigured with different weapons or tactics to reduce the civilian harm. A failure to spare civilians when the military advantage is only marginal or merely equal to the harm is a violation of IHL.
And this restrictive nature of proportionality, it's reinforced by that broader principle you mentioned earlier, military necessity. Just remind us, what's the fundamental purpose of that principle?
Right. Military necessity basically permits a state to use only that degree and that kind of force, which isn't otherwise prohibited by law, like targeting civilians that is required to achieve the legitimate purpose of the conflict. And that purpose is generally defined as achieving the complete or partial submission of the enemy as quickly as possible and ideally with the minimum expenditure of life and resources on all sides. But it's a double-edged sword. It permits actions that are genuinely necessary for the war effort, but crucially, it also prohibits anything that is unnecessary. Destroying civilian infrastructure that has absolutely no bearing on the current conflict, for instance, is prohibited partly because it's militarily unnecessary, quite apart from proportionality rules.
Okay, we've laid out this complex, almost theoretical legal framework. But now we really have to ground this discussion in the reality of what these concepts, distinction, proportionality, excessive harm, actually mean for the people on the ground, say in Paktika. It's easy to talk about ratios and equations, but our sources force us to remember the human stories behind those numbers.
Absolutely. The legal abstraction, it can feel very cold, and it frankly fails completely when you look at the reality for those killed or injured. Civilian victims, especially in these kinds of strikes, are often tragically referred to as the uncounted. And this isn't just a term for those who unfortunately died. It often refers to a systemic failure to even accurately document their deaths, to acknowledge their existence in the official tallies.
Why? Why are they uncounted? Is it just a data collection problem in chaotic environments?
It's partly that, yes, but it's often more complex. It can be a combination of, well, institutional failure, maybe a lack of will to investigate thoroughly, and the inherent difficulties of conflict zones. Particularly in remote areas or with strikes conducted by drones, the military force conducting the strike is often the primary, sometimes the only, source of casualty information. And unsurprisingly, this tends to lead to a massive discrepancy between official figures and estimates from ground sources or independent monitors. Our sources consistently show that the number of civilian casualties in many campaigns is frequently far, far more significant than what governments or military spokespeople publicly admit. And the anecdotes we hear, like the mention of victims often being just ordinary civilians sleeping in their houses, people like Mayada Razo mentioned in one source, they really highlight that these aren't always individuals caught in a crossfire during active combat. These are people who should have been definitively protected by the principle of distinction in the first place.
It's the longer-term impact, isn't it? The impact on the community, the survivors, that often gets completely overlooked in the immediate news cycle, focusing just on the strike itself. The human cost just ripples outwards, potentially creating more instability down the line.
That's absolutely vital to understand. This specific conflict between Pakistan and the TTP, it's not happening in some kind of vacuum. It's embedded within a much larger ongoing humanitarian context in the region, and we see this really acutely with the massive displacement crisis that's been unfolding there.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of that displacement?
Well, since around October 2023, Pakistan initiated a very widespread campaign to return undocumented Afghan refugees back to Afghanistan. The scale is just staggering. According to the reports we've seen, something like 783,918 individuals have returned to Afghanistan since that campaign began. Now, this mass influx of people, regardless of the specific reasons for their return, places an almost intolerable strain on what are already incredibly limited local resources and governance structures inside Afghanistan.
Right. So even if, say, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency reported that this immediate influx might not significantly affect the Taliban's overall military dominance in the short term, the pressure on social cohesion, on basic services, on regional stability, that must be immense.
It absolutely is. And it circles back to the proportionality idea in a broader sense. The pursuit of security through military action, which is Pakistan's stated goal here, combating terrorism, it has to be assessed against the potential for causing massive destruction of the very things needed for long-term stability. If military strikes and the policies associated with them, like mass deportations, lead to the destruction of economic opportunities, cultural heritage, vital infrastructure, things critical for the survival of the civilian population, well, then the original objective of achieving lasting security becomes fundamentally undermined. It can be self-defeating. The law, in spirit, demands you weigh that immediate gain against the potential for long-term devastating consequences.
Okay, let's bring this discussion back to the perspective of, say, the military headquarters in Pakistan making these decisions. The stated strategic objective was clear: target that TTP training camp in the Paktika province. But what were the broader strategic motivations likely at play here, beyond just hitting that one camp?
Well, the overarching objective is consistently framed as combating terrorism and, restoring security along that porous border. However, the timing here seems critical. The sources suggest that the recent border skirmishes, the constant drumbeat of TTP cross-border attacks from Afghanistan, had almost certainly strained relations between Islamabad and the Taliban regime in Kabul to, well, perhaps a breaking point. So there was likely immense pressure on Pakistan, both domestically and perhaps internationally, to take decisive, visible action. Action that demonstrates resolve, maybe forces the Taliban to police their side of the border more effectively, or at least disrupts the TTP's ability to operate freely there.
And once that strategic decision to strike is made, the commander on the ground or overseeing the operation, they have these specific obligations. Under IHL, you mentioned the constant care requirement. That goes far beyond just ticking a box on a proportionality checklist, right?
Absolutely. The requirement to take constant care to spare the civilian population. It's supposed to permeate every decision from the highest strategic level down to operational planning and the final tactical execution. It's meant to be a continuous, active obligation, not a passive one.
So what specific, practical, feasible precautions does IHL actually mandate that commanders must take before an attack is launched?
They're generally grouped into a few key areas. First, and maybe most obviously, verifying that the target is indeed a legitimate military objective and not, say, a civilian structure that's been misidentified. Second, choosing the means and methods of attack that minimize incidental loss. This could mean using the smallest necessary bomb or munition for the target, attacking at a time when civilians are least likely to be present, or using precision-guided weapons where feasible. And third, critically, refraining from launching any attack which is expected after doing that assessment to be excessive to fail the proportionality test. This implies the intelligence gathering process can't be rushed or based on flimsy, unreliable data.
I find the target selection rule you mentioned particularly interesting. It sounds almost like an anti-gambling rule for commanders, forcing a conservative choice.
It's one of the strongest mechanisms in IHL that explicitly prioritizes civilian life when options exist. If a commander has a choice between several different military objectives, all of which would achieve a similar military advantage, say, disrupting TTP communications equally, they must select the objective whose attack is anticipated to cause the least danger to civilians and civilian objects. It prevents a commander from, say, taking the operationally easier target if it poses a significantly higher risk to civilians, when another target could achieve the same military result with less collateral damage.
And what about the inherent uncertainty of war? The fog of war. How does the legal framework account for the probability of success? Does an attack have to be likely to succeed to be lawful?
That's a really important dimension. The proportionality calculus isn't just two-dimensional comparing advantage versus harm. It's arguably three-dimensional. Commanders must also consider the probability that the attack will actually achieve the anticipated military advantage. This means that launching very high-risk attacks, attacks where there's a low probability of successfully hitting the target or achieving the desired effect, becomes legally questionable, especially if the expected civilian harm is significant. Why? Because if the chance of achieving the military advantage is low, then that advantage isn't truly concrete and direct as required by the rule. You cannot legally justify causing high expected civilian loss for a merely possible or unlikely military gain.
Okay, this leads us right into the really difficult ethical territory that runs parallel to the law. There's this concept, the doctrine of double effect, which some use to ethically justify civilian casualties, arguing they were foreseen but not intended, merely a side effect of targeting a legitimate military objective. Proportionality provides the legal constraint here, but where does the moral obligation potentially go further?
Proportionality sets the legal floor, the minimum standard. But morality, ethics, often suggests a higher ceiling of responsibility. The ethical core here is that a commander can't simply hide behind the intention to hit a military target to justify any number or level of civilian casualties, no matter how horrific. If the conceivable harm is truly grave, disproportionate in a moral sense, even if arguably legal, the ethical constraint should hold.
And does this ethical dimension, or even the legal framework itself, ever require the attacking force to actually risk its own personnel to minimize civilian harm? Or is that purely a moral ideal, not a legal requirement?
This is probably one of the most fraught and debated areas in modern military ethics and law. IHL doesn't explicitly state, you must accept X number of casualties among your own troops to save Y number of civilians, However, many legal scholars and ethicists interpret the general obligations of constant care and the underlying principle of humanity to imply a positive commitment to save civilian lives. This suggests there's a strong moral argument and perhaps an emerging legal expectation in some interpretations that the attacking force should accept some level of increased risk to itself in order to significantly minimize harm to protect its civilians. This could mean, for example, avoiding those high-altitude bombing runs that prioritize pilot safety but compromise accuracy, maybe choosing lower, riskier flight paths, or perhaps using ground troops in certain situations despite the higher risk, or employing lower-yield weapons that require getting closer to the target. It's a constant tension.
Let's talk about the chilling realities of how this proportionality assessment sometimes plays out in practice, particularly looking at historical precedent involving high-value targets. What sort of level of expected civilian casualty have military analysts or states historically seem to consider potentially acceptable when the goal is eliminating a major enemy commander, someone deemed highly dangerous?
Yeah, this is where the cold mathematics of warfare becomes really stark and uncomfortable to discuss, but it's important to understand the precedents. Case studies like analyses surrounding operations to eliminate high-level commanders, individuals like Salah Shahada in Gaza, or perhaps someone like General Chemical Ali Hassan al-Majid in Iraq. These analyses suggest that states have, in certain past instances, treated expected civilian casualty numbers somewhere in the range of 20 to 50 civilian lives as potentially acceptable collateral damage.
20 to 50 confirmed civilian deaths to eliminate one person. That's an astonishing number for our audience to process.
It is. It's deeply shocking. And it really underscores that extreme pressure point where perceived vital national security interests clash directly with fundamental humanitarian principles. However, it's absolutely crucial to qualify this. This kind of high threshold is typically only considered potentially defensible in legal arguments if the anticipated military advantage is judged to be exceptionally significant, like preventing major future terrorist attacks, potentially shortening a war significantly, and if the probability of successfully eliminating that specific high-value target is near certain, and if there was absolutely no other less harmful way to achieve that result. So this isn't some kind of common guideline or acceptable ratio for everyday operations. It reflects an analysis of historical practice in very specific extreme scenarios involving uniquely valuable targets. But it does show just how enormous the perceived military advantage has to be before states even begin to contemplate justifying that level of expected collateral damage.
Analyzing this specific Paktika strike through the lens of proportionality, it really shows us just how complex, how subjective, and frankly, how difficult the law of war truly is to apply in the real world. But these kinds of events, they have implications that stretch far beyond just the immediate conflict zone, don't they? They can affect the entire international legal system.
Indeed, they really can. We live in an era where wars are fought in an intensely legalized space. Whether we like it or not, international law provides the universal vocabulary, the common language, for debating the legitimacy of using force. When Pakistan or any other nation conducts an airstrike like this, they feel compelled to justify it using these legal terms: necessity, distinction, proportionality.
But our sources also highlighted a significant risk here that aggressive interpretations or applications of these rules, especially by powerful states, can lead to something called doctrinal decay. Can you explain what that means?
Doctrinal decay refers to the potential fragmentation, the weakening of the international legal system that can happen when states start using law-sounding vocabulary, throwing around phrases like concrete and direct military advantage, or claiming they took all feasible precautions essentially as a shield to protect purely political or strategic decisions from genuine legal scrutiny and accountability. By consistently stretching the definitions of IHL concepts to fit their perceived needs or interpreting them in self-serving ways, they risk eroding the universal understanding and application of those norms. It chips away at the system, potentially fragmenting it strike by strike. If every state just reinterprets proportionality in its own favor whenever it's convenient, then the rule eventually ceases to be a meaningful constraint on behavior.
And we actually see evidence of that kind of fragmentation in practice already, don't we?
Yeah.
Even among allied nations, the way different legal systems handle similar situations can vary significantly.
Absolutely. You mentioned the example of international immunity cases. You might see courts in the U.S. focusing primarily on distinguishing between a foreign state's sovereign versus its commercial acts to decide whether to grant immunity from lawsuits, whereas courts in Europe increasingly might adopt more of a human rights focus. They might be willing to exercise jurisdiction over a foreign state, even for sovereign acts, if there's no other effective alternative legal remedy available for victims of, say, torture or war crimes crimes allegedly committed by that state's officials. These differing legal approaches, different bases for decisions, they can rupture the intended unity of international norms, making the pursuit of justice for civilian victims of conflict incredibly inconsistent and dependent on where they happen to seek redress.
This really brings us back full circle, doesn't it? Back to that bedrock principle of IHL we discussed, the obligation of constant care.
That really is the core mandate, the animating spirit of this area of law. That obligation to take constant care to mitigate risk, to spare civilians whenever possible. It must inform all levels of decision-making, strategic, operational, and tactical. It means that if there's ambiguity, if the intelligence is unclear, if the legal interpretation is debatable, the commander can't just default to the most militarily expedient option. They have an active duty to pause, to question, to seek clarification, and ultimately to act in a way that prioritizes civilian safety.
And if we apply that proportionality rule specifically in a scenario where the outcome is genuinely ambiguous or the scales seem balanced, how should that balance of doubt be tilted according to the law's underlying principles?
The proportionality rule itself is fundamentally rooted in two underlying policies. Military necessity on one hand, but crucially humanity on the other. Therefore, when in genuine doubt, when it's truly unclear whether the expected civilian harm will be excessive compared to the military advantage, the application of the rule must tilt the balance toward humanity. The fundamental obligation to spare civilians, which is the cornerstone of IHL, has to prevail over speculative or uncertain military advantage. That principle is ultimately what distinguishes regulated warfare, however imperfect, from simply indiscriminate violence.
So this whole review, looking at the Pakistani airstrikes, the reactions, the legal framework, it ultimately leads us back to a really profound philosophical and legal challenge, doesn't it? We started by asking when civilian casualties are considered justified under law. And IHL gave us this complex, subjective, context-dependent definition revolving around the term excessive.
Right. And some of the source material we looked at even pushes this a step further. It suggests that the idea of an absolute degree of unacceptable collateral damage, a level of harm that is prohibited regardless of the military advantage, is not actually unthinkable within the framework of IHL. This potentially takes us beyond just the relative balancing test of proportionality.
Which raises that ultimate, maybe unanswerable question that we really want to leave with you, our listener, to think about. How do we, as global citizens, as observers of these conflicts, how do we begin to define that absolute outer boundary, that level of destruction where no conceivable military necessity, no matter how significant, could possibly justify the human cost? Is there a number of civilian deaths, 50, 100, 500, or perhaps the destruction of an entire neighborhood, regardless of the target within it, that must simply be defined as prohibited? It's inherently disproportionate under IHL, regardless of the claimed value of the military target. Trying to define that absolute boundary, that's the immense challenge we all face moving forward.
We've tried today to explore the legal framework, the strategic realities surrounding these recent border conflicts. Hopefully, we've provided you with the tools, the context, to critically assess the justifications offered for military actions against the confirmed and often uncounted human cost. Understanding the complexities, the subjectivity, and the potential loopholes within the proportionality principle is really the first crucial step, isn't it? It's the first step towards being able to demand better transparency, stricter adherence to humanitarian norms, and greater accountability from all states involved in conflict, including Pakistan in this instance.
That concludes our review today, looking at the legal framework and the very real-world costs associated with actions like the recent Pakistani airstrikes. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us here on the Global WarWatch Network.
Thank you very much for your time and participation. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to Global WarWatch Network if you found this valuable. Also, we genuinely encourage you to share your own thoughts and perspectives in the comments section below. And please do join the conversation with us on social media. All the links you need are provided in the description.